Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Cherno Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. Our American friend TJ is on the FaceTime, and we've got a lot to talk about this week after all the artificial drama in the United States. So, TJ, I guess what do you want to know?
What an existential question, Dale. This week after, I guess we're almost in the week after the election cycle. One of the things that has really caught my eye through all of this is international explainers of the electoral college system. From my background and where I've lived, I have a lot of friends from all over the world and family members all over the world, and it's been really interesting to see the way things are contextualized for domestic news outlets abroad for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been wondering, obviously Canada has its own takes on these things too. And I'm wondering if you were doing sort of the ultimate procedural, specifically procedural explainer, what are your kind of, top couple, two or three or whatever thoughts on the most important distinctions between the electoral process in the democracy of Republic of America and the federally managed election process in this constitutional monarchy in Canada?
I guess the top thing is that we don't directly elect our prime minister, versus how there's a quasi-direct election of a president in the US. So that really fundamentally changes how we conceive and how we think of how our elections work.
Mm-hmm.
So our prime minister is appointed by the governor general, usually as the leader of the party that wins the most seats in an election. There's a tiny amount of gray area around that, but 99.5% of it is, the leader of the party that wins the most seat after an election.
Has there been a case where that wasn't the case, or there's just room for it not to be the case?
There's room for it not to be the case, particularly because the incumbent always stays in until they resign. So even after the election, they stay in power until they give the indication of, we don't have the seats anymore, I'm going to resign. Or if it's a hung parliament, then there's room to maneuver in terms of, well, if I can forge a working partnership with one of the other parties, then I don't have to resign, kind of thing. So that's where the gray area comes in there, but most of the time it's just the leader of the party that wins the most seats. So it's one of the biggest differences in how we conceive of elections versus how Americans do.
That's really interesting, actually, because the whole looking at what is the thing that we look at inside our governments as the people have spoken, therefore X happens, occurs at very different points. I think it sounds like in the change of power.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, I'm not sure what other, I guess, top two I can think of offhand, but it's just like that. That's the biggest, most fundamental difference between our systems, and I don't know that enough Canadians actually appreciate that difference, because we still, in colloquial conversation, refer to things as though we elect the prime minister directly, or as though it's the prime minister's name on the ballot, and that's not how it works. But we conceive of it similarly to the Americans, in large part because we're just so inundated with American pop culture and American news, and we start thinking of Canadian institutions in similar ways, even though they don't actually match up.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, even the emergence of that. We have the famous slash infamous Nate Silver and his 538 in the States.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a Canadian equivalent, 338. Did I get the number right?
Yeah, so. Yeah, 338.
Yeah, there we
go. That's the number of ridings in the House of Commons.
But even looking at, I did look at that site a couple of times. It was interesting. It's obviously statistics oriented as well. But I found it interesting the different points of interest, things that seem to be worth commenting on in the Canadian media when it came to the points of the U.S. election. What do you think about the Canadian coverage I mean, even looking at 538 and 338 as these kind of echo chambers, I guess, for each other in certain ways.
In Canadian coverage of the American election,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the best person to ask that actually, because I was consciously tuning out a lot of it, because a lot of it is just getting caught up in the same kind of coverage you get in the US. Sometimes they would try and, what does this mean for Canada? But oftentimes that got lost in just the kind of horse race reporting around Americana.
That is a really interesting term, the horse race reporting, because that's actually what it felt like when I was watching or reading some Canadian coverage. And I found myself turning more to other international outlets to see some contrast as opposed to looking at the Canadian ones. And
Yeah,
then when it comes to Canadian media coverage of its own elections, we've had some interesting scenarios happening in this week. Many interesting scenarios, one of which was, three major networks cutting away from a president speaking under the presidential seal, which is,
yeah.
if not literally unprecedented, feels unprecedented in contemporary times. And the sense of obligation to cover that if the president speaks, these big networks are going to cover it and bring that word to the people. What do you? I mean, do we even have something like that up here? Is there some kind of pact that there's an obligation to cover?
There is generally an obligation to cover, but we did have an incident a few years ago where all of the major media outlets, most of the major media outlets, decided to boycott a couple of speeches from Prime Minister Stephen Harper because he was trying to impose certain rules on the press gallery in Ottawa, which would essentially, because the press gallery is self-governing and we basically run our own show when it comes to press conferences, we decide who gets to ask questions and so on, and he was trying to remove that ability. So he wanted to have people sign up on a list so that he could dictate who would ask the questions and who wouldn't. And part of pushing back on that was boycotting a couple speeches. Didn't last very long because some outlets decided in the end, if no one else is covering it, then we do, and then we get it as like an exclusive, and then it fell apart shortly thereafter.
Well,
So
I mean, that could be predicted, I suppose, in the cutthroat world of journalism, and mixed with capitalism, mixed with the digital age.
yeah, so
When it comes, yeah, go ahead.
so that's just kind of what happened in terms of that situation. But at the same time, I think most of the broadcasters here. I mean, when even back during earlier this year when it was the early days of the pandemic, and we'd have a daily thing from the Prime Minister, and everyone would cut away from it on their regular broadcast hours, as opposed to just news channels. So I mean, there is still some sense of obligation around that, but it's become less so. And now that these kind of semi-daily briefings are now back in vogue again, the regular broadcast channels aren't cutting to them anymore. It's just the news channels. So we're kind of back to that place again.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I'm just envisioning the chaos of any semblance of organization around trying to boycott a presidential speech by a large number of outlets from the establishment media. And it's not something that I enjoy thinking about, the results of that on every side of, forget it, both sides of the aisle, everywhere across the country.
Right, and you've got a very different media ecosystem as well, where what's on Fox and what's on CNN are completely different, and it's almost completely separate realities, and we don't really have that up here. We've got much more of a uniformity. One might even say mediocrity, but it's much more uniform up here in terms of what it is that is being covered and how it's being portrayed.
Well, one thing that I feel like, it's hardly a fresh observation, but, obviously with this whole fake news, all of that stuff that's come out of the U.S., and the quick skill that people around the world have used to deploy that phrase in morally scant situations, is this idea that is there an actual, is the news based on fact, and then everything else is op-ed. I mean, that's something, there's a reason that op-eds are a different category historically. There's a reason that panel shows have historically not been the mainstay of the actual reporting of the news directly, that this has happened, and this is what we can think might happen next. You know, like, it's
Yeah.
a very interesting hinge there. Do you see an evolution in the Canadian media towards that, or do you think it's kind of, I mean, I'm biased against it, so I will say, do you think the Canadian media is safe from it?
No, we're not safe from it because too many of us see what's going on in the States and want to emulate it. We consider it kind of like the grown-up leagues, even though it's really not. So there is too much of an instinct to kind of copy it here in Canada.
Do you think some of the instincts around the grown-up leagues concept comes from just the scale of the media ecosystem in the U.S.?
That's
How many people you're getting with your percentages? Like, just the millions and millions in each demographic, the millions and millions that permit this fracturing at an establishment level of media output?
that's part of it. It's reach, it's budgets,
It's budgets, yeah.
and it's we're kind of brought up with this inbred sense of kind of being second best to the Americans all the time, so we kind of always reflect as that. And so if we're seeing Americans doing something, there is often an instinct that we need to do it too. This kind of Me Too, in a different context from the current hashtag Me Too.
Yes, I understand.
But we always kind of have this notion that we want to be doing the same kinds of things, and we also have this I find the notion of somewhat absurd, but notion that American politics are inherently more exciting, and we enough people in our media system have an envy of that, so they keep trying to find ways in which to replicate that sense of excitement, and for better or for worse.
Well, that's very interesting because the connection between, I mean, I'm literally thinking of I think it's Stephen Covey, who did the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Yeah.
And has that quadrant of importance and urgency.
Mm-hmm.
And what is in that top right quadrant of urgent and important, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can see why people inside Canada or outside it would feel that there's not the tone of urgency in news reporting here, compared to its parallels in the States. I don't think that's a bad thing in many things, especially when it comes to, the rolling ramifications of urgency. Is one thing I've always enjoyed about the responsibility of business journalism, is that you understand that if you put an adjective in the wrong place, it can move the stock market, right? Is it an expected drop or an unexpected drop?
Yeah.
Those things matter, right? So I do think that, there's a clash between responsibility of journalism and the urgency of reporting. And I don't know if that's an appropriate division, but it is interesting to hear your take on the fact that you see that Canadian media is vulnerable to that. And you have seen the rise of it in other places. France has a very fractured media system in terms of, you can watch what you want, kind of, and get the news you want, presented the way you want it. And in India, my family, we spend a lot of time there. And it is surreal. You can literally not understand the world from one channel to the other because it seems like it's literally different things that are happening. Forget opinions or takes. So this is a pervasive problem, obviously, and it's something that we've seen, with cultural fracturing and everything. Even down to, the debate around Netflix and it's being taxed. I don't know what's happening with that. That's a whole other interesting thing with media and culture.
Yeah,
from
it's
the U.S. and its regulation up here. Is there a pushback?
Yeah, and this is one of the constant. This has always been in Canada as long as we've had broadcasting. Is this? I wouldn't say paranoia because it's fairly well founded. This notion that if we don't do something to protect our cultural space, then we will simply become a colony of the American media. And so we have broadcast regulations to ensure a certain amount of Canadian content, so we can tell our own stories and not just just air American media and call it a day. Broadcasters will rail about it, and I mean this is a whole other separate conversation, but that's part of what's behind it. And so now with the broadcast ecosystem changing, they're looking to extend that to streaming services, things like Netflix and Disney Plus, so that they have Canadian offerings on their services. And part of this is you pay into a media fund, and then you get to draw from that media fund to create Canadian content. So there is give and take there, but that's kind of what it's around. And just one of those kinds of things that is just interesting is that an actress that I am acquainted with over the Twitter machine once remarked that in Toronto sound stages, there's 2 or 3 different White House standing sets there for shows that they film in Toronto that are American. But we have no standing sets in this country of the House of Commons.
That is very interesting. And again, I guess it's the straight up capitalism of it. That is fascinating.
And it also just kind of gives us a sense that we don't find our politics interesting enough to tell our own stories about it.
I wonder if, something that's interesting to me is that might be some of this staying in the straight lane with news reporting in Canada can be connected in any way to the obligation to translate across languages. And you have to be even more careful to make sure, if you're already translating news and etc., and things have to be available in 2 languages at a very official level, how does that influence, how rogue a media group can go in its own presentation? And again, in international circles, when I was living in Switzerland, there was, I don't know if that's still the case, there was a rule about, you had to have a certain airtime of songs in Italian, German, and French, because obviously, those are the languages spoken there, versus English language. And it was literally just a matter of minutes on the air. But I do wonder how that influences news reporting, because when you've already got one thing that needs to be so precise, and the obligation to be able to translate something, do you think that affects in any way Canada's perspective on this?
To a certain extent, yes, but you will also find there are places in which political parties will speak different messages in the different languages. And that's when it becomes interesting to find out who they're trying to communicate to, if they're giving one message in English and one message in French. So that is another one of the kind of quirks, I guess, of our own kind of media system. And there are places where we had an instance a couple weeks ago where Trudeau said something in French and didn't say it in English. And the French media took off with it much sooner than the English media did. It took them a day or two to kind of catch up to it. And it became a big, huge thing. But that was kind of the early days of it. It's like, well, you guys don't pay attention to what he says in French. And it's not entirely untrue.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's something I'm going to be looking at, I think, with a closer attention to the details of this, especially because there are rumblings about the next elections already here for next year, for 2021. But just to actually look at that, basically the ultimate, market segmentation of your political message includes the way you say things in which language over which network or in which demographic. And I think that, obviously that's an interesting angle with the possibilities of breaking down your message and targeting with the online world now. Obviously, Facebook and Twitter have been in the crosshairs of every election watchdog, as they should be, given their influence. But even they have said that as soon as President Trump becomes, former President Trump, he will not have the world leader status on Twitter that permits him to not have his tweets taken down, only merely flagged.
Yeah.
So this is a very interesting development up here that I'm thinking about, and it'll be interesting to see if it like, I mean, sorry, it's an interesting development down in there that I'm thinking about up here to see if there's any responsibility watchdog when it comes to Twitter, Facebook, etc. the next time there's an election in Canada.
Yeah, it's a constant question.
Lovely, just what we wanted in these existential days to bring it back full circle with more questions. But as you know, I will always be curious about this stuff.
And we appreciate it. Thanks again. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.